What is your educational and professional background, and how did you develop an interest in the study of origins?
Well, I started out actually as a history student as an undergraduate, and then was required to take chemistry. Uh, and there was a section on molecular biology where the lactose operon was presented, phage lambda, and I was so intrigued that I eventually changed my major. So I did undergraduate work in microbiology, graduate work in microbiology at Iowa State University. I postdoced at Purdue, did a stint in industry for a little over a year, and then postdoced at Princeton and in molecular biology, and I've taught at Tulane and the University of Idaho, where I am now.
When did you first start having doubts about Darwinian evolution?
Pretty early. I mean, I had no reason to doubt it when I started out. It was, I think, towards my junior year when I really began looking at the complexity of the systems that were involved and the language that was used, in describing them. Very design-oriented, and so, I was at that point willing to consider other interpretations.
In the introduction to his Origin of Species, Charles Darwin wrote, "I am well aware that there is scarcely a single point discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result could be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts on both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be done here." Based upon this first critical review of the origin, by Darwin himself, what opposite conclusions might one come to?
Well, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, science is dealing with hypotheses and disproving those hypotheses if possible. So in biology, we're faced with this question of design. All biologists, I think, would agree that there is an appearance of design. The question then boils down to, is it real or is it only apparent? Most would say it's only apparent. But there are two sides to the coin, and we should be addressing both. Darwin was perfectly legitimate. In fact, compelled to say, this is my theory. There are other sides to it that need to be addressed, maybe even points that would logically counter what I'm proposing, but he threw it on the table, and we should address it critically, continuously as new data comes in. I don't think we've done it.
Sir Fred Hoyle has written, "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. If the universe was brought into existence by what appears to be a super-intellect, why would scientists still believe that all biological information has ultimately arisen by blind chance?"
Based on our paradigm today in doing science, we're looking for natural explanations. And I think that's legitimate. I mean, if there's a natural explanation, go with it. You don't need anything further. With the systems that we're dealing with, we don't have natural explanations, yet it is, straying verboten to look at alternatives if they have religious or metaphysical implications. So by default, we define science as only dealing with natural explanations. If they imply other, that's out of bounds.
Albert Einstein wrote, "The scientist is possessed by the sense of universal causation. His religious feeling takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, which reveals an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection." What led Einstein to conclude this, and why do scientists who honor themselves not honor the lawgiver and creator of their subject matter?
I think it's a natural response of man, I would say, in a fallen world. Einstein was correct in saying, looking at nature, looking at whether it's biological or just the universe as it presents itself to us, is awe-compelling. I mean, there's nothing more satisfying than to dissect something and understand how it works for the first time. I mean, that's the carrot that all scientists live by. What I find interesting is that, when I was an undergraduate, the thing that drew me to biology was, again, this language. This is a beautiful system. Look at the pattern that we see developing here, the checks and balances and the algorithm to make this or to do that. And that has continued since, I think, molecular biology until recently. And I'm concerned now when I hear colleagues, and this happened this summer when I was at a meeting for bioinformatics, ascribing E. coli is equivalent to the space shuttle, in terms of the number of components, the complexity, and that's very much, in order with a design interpretation. But then the same individual, when it came to the question of evolution, was saying, well, these are really Rube Goldberg, apparatuses, very sloppy, and I've heard this theme coming up more and more, which is counter to what we are really seeing, that these are cobbled together systems, that there's no reason why. I think that's injustice to what we're doing, but it is necessary, I think, to counter where students would naturally go with the information, is that you're describing this as a piece of engineering. Where's the engineer? Instead of now, well, it's not really quite that complex. There's a natural explanation, and this really isn't as beautiful as we may have led you to believe initially. So there's some backtracking going on there. And
please comment on this quote from Pierre-Paul Grasset. Directed by all-powerful selection, chance becomes a sort of providence, which under the cover of atheism is not named, but which is secretly worshipped.
Well, I mean, you see that in the biological sciences in particular, that taking a different tact on this material, implying that there is a creator, there is a designer, is heretical. And it can be uncomfortable. So there is this underlying assumption that, there is no higher authority involved in the process, that we can't explain it by naturalism. And I've seen this over and over again in my own experience and the experience of my children as they've gone to the university, and teaching with colleagues, that they'll have no problem with drawing metaphysical, conclusions from their data. Your only purpose in life is to replicate your DNA. And that will pass, nothing said. But really, that's a profound theological position to take. And underlying it leads you to this concept that really there is no point, there is no value in, an individual, other than the fact that they're just a machine to replicate information.
Would you comment on this quote from Swedish biologist Soren Lovetrop? The reasons for rejecting Darwin's proposal were many, but first of all, that many innovations cannot possibly come into existence through the accumulation of many small steps, and even if they can, natural selection cannot accomplish it because incipient and intermediate stages are not advantageous.
Right, I think that's really the argument of irreducible complexity, that you have compilation of multiple molecular machines in the cell, all of which have numerous components. 50 is, individual parts is not extraordinary. Removal of any one of them would render the system non-functional, and many of these are essential. So if you're looking at the ribosome, if you're looking at DNA replication, if you're looking at messenger RNA processing, the bacterial flagellum, all of these are highly complex multi-component machines. We call them machines. So we've got to be able to, then if natural selection is true, at some point account for even the most simplistic of these systems, and we don't have that information at present. So, I would agree with a quote, and it brings back to there are many counter-arguments to Darwinism. We're not addressing them, and I think we can address them on a question of scientific interpretation, and they may have metaphysical implications, but certainly the other side has the same implications. So let's look at both sides.
Charles Darwin pointed out in The Descent of Man that natural selection would act to preserve those individuals which were least encumbered with a superfluous part. Rather than argue that neo-Darwinian processes are insufficient to account for the gradual evolution of irreducibly complex systems, couldn't the case be made that natural selection would actually prevent major evolutionary change from occurring on a gradual step-by-step basis, and thus help account for the natural phenomenon of stasis?
Yeah, this is that's the crux of Darwinism and Darwin's interpretation that you over time and gradual change accumulate different structures, different dedicated systems within the cell that can account for the diversity of life that we see. We don't know the genetic capacity of any organism to change at this point. And it looks like built into these systems there are, into cells there are systems to prevent change. We look at the fossil record, we certainly see that. Stasis is the norm, and then you see an explosion or radiation of new organisms. That's the difficulty. We don't have the answers yet.
How would natural selection, for example, inhibit the gradual evolution of the bacterial flagellum?
This is work that I've been intimately involved in, and the bacterial flagellum has been termed by people that work in the field as the most efficient machine in the universe. It defies our own intelligence at this point to produce a machine with this capability at the scale that these machines operate. These are nano machines. If you look at any review article on the bacterial flagellum that addresses the genetics, each gene is designated with a phenotype of the cell if that gene is mutated. And they all either negate motility, they knock out motility, or they severely affect the cell and its ability to monitor its environment and respond to changes using motion. By definition, the flagellum is irreducibly complex. If it wasn't, we wouldn't know a whole lot about it because all the genes were defined by mutations and loss of motility. Further, what I find interesting is if this is a process of gradualism, where are these components coming from? You've got to borrow them from another system within the cell. So every protein has had, at some point in its history, a dual purpose, then to be, incorporated into a new function. There are, in my own work, we've worked on bubonic plague, which, since it was first isolated at the turn of the last century, was defined as a non-modal organism. And we had reason to believe that perhaps some of the genes were present and maybe operational. And now that we have the entire sequence, we find that there's a mutation in the master control gene to build a flagellum, that it had a single base pair insertion as some history in the life of that organism. And I sat down with a graduate student and we went through the entire genome, identifying all the flagellar genes by comparison to other systems, Salmonella, E. coli. And because these organisms can no longer build a flagellum, and they have mutation in the top tier of the hierarchy, all the genes downstream now are rendered functionless. They have no function. And they are just sinks for further mutations. We found multiple deletions, insertions, which we can identify just by by looking at the DNA. Point mutations we couldn't, but I assume they are there as well. Some of the genes are still functional. If we take them out and put them in a mutant of E. coli for that same gene, they will complement the mutation. But the point being, if it's gradualism and you build up to 49 to 50 genes and you're still missing that one component, do you have time to sit around and wait for the final component to come into place when everything else downstream is really, since it has no function, you're selecting against it. You're losing it. I've even brought this, in discussions with my colleagues, and they say, well, I mean, that's Darwinism. If you don't use it, you lose it. Well, you can't have it both ways. And that's the point. If you're going to build it by gradualism, then how can you at the same time say, if you lose a component, everything else is non-functional, you're going to lose that? It's a circular argument, and I just don't buy it.
Does the idea of intelligent design open new empirical possibilities for scientists to explore? If so, would you explain?
I think this goes to the very heart of science, and it's something that we've lost sight of, and I think it behooves us to maybe consider the consequences of where we are now. Why is it that Western civilization, based on a Judeo-Christian heritage, spawned the science that we now use? I mean, and this is, I think, agreed upon by secular historians, that it wasn't an accident that science, modern science, came out of a Christian worldview. There was purpose. And there was purpose both from the aesthetic viewpoint and from the practical. Science, understanding, builds technology, makes life better for your fellow man, for your neighbor. And we're compelled to study nature because there is a designer that is outside of nature that's operating on the laws of logic, and we can do an experiment today and we repeat it, we'll get the same results tomorrow. Not all cultures will, sustain that way of thinking. It was very successful, and I think the history of man is when he thinks he's independent, then he loses sight of the heritage that perhaps bought him that information, that position. So the worldview, I think, is compatible. Now, along with that comes intent, logic. There's a reason, there's a purpose for these things, and we can use design principles to understand them, and we still do that. And we use reverse engineering in the laboratory. I find it interesting that in my own department, I think I'm one of perhaps two professors that have read Darwin. None of us have had formal courses in evolution, yet we're successful scientists. We do use the principles of design in reverse engineering, breaking things, trying to figure out how they work, logical patterns, and then most often the interpretation comes after the system is defined, and that Darwinian spin is put on it. It's not predictive, it's usually postscriptive in terms of how we're going to then interpret what we've discovered from a Darwinian viewpoint.
Would you agree that the purpose of science is to most accurately model natural processes, even if they inhibit major evolutionary change from occurring?
Definitely. I mean, that's the ball game. You go where the data leads you. And even if you disagree with the implications, we've seen this time and time again. I mean, scientists are people, and careers are built on their interpretation of their specialty, and at times it conflicts. And we've got examples of Niels Bohr in terms of the structure of the atom, Einstein in terms of expanding universes, Jacques Minnich even in terms of genetic regulation. Everything had to be based on a repressor model, and transcriptional activators just didn't fit in. So we're compelled, I think, again, it goes back to the idea of science. You have a hypothesis, it makes predictions, you're compelled to do the experiments. If they're contradictory, then you've got to include that with everything that you present. Okay, and it's only going to, that's how science works. I mean, it's the serendipity of having an idea, going and performing the experiment, and if it doesn't come out the way that you thought, well, good, because you were wrong, and it's only going to lead you to a deeper understanding.
Why can't microevolution be extrapolated to account for major evolutionary change?
The question of microevolution, and that's one of the fundamental tenets of Darwinism, is that you have small, gradual changes that over time will develop into major changes in diversity. When we look at these, whether peppered moths or antibiotic resistance in insects or bacteria, I don't think it's valid to make that extrapolation. In fact, from my own experience in looking at antibiotic resistance, I think it's counter to what you would predict. If we're just looking at mutations, now this isn't lateral gene transfer and gaining enzymes that have degraded function on antibiotic function, but in terms of something like streptomycin resistance, where you have a mutation in a ribosomal protein and renders the cell resistant to the drug. This is a common example of microevolution in practice, but when you really analyze it, it's a almost degenerative effect. You've messed up the information processing system. These organisms are at a disadvantage. They can get compensatory mutations that will bring them back up to the level of growth as a parental wild type, but these have costs, fitness costs as well. And I see it more as what we say in evolution in terms, Mueller's ratchet, that you just continually ratchet the organism's ability to respond to changing environments in a negative sense. And extinction is the final result. You're leading these organisms down a genetic box canyon, not the complexifying mutations that are going to generate, a multicellular organism from a single-celled organism.
If we assume that no creator was involved in the origin and history of life, then universal common ancestry simply must be true. Are there any tests for common ancestry, or is universal common ancestry simply assumed for philosophical or methodological reasons?
We've been through the last 25 years in microbiology of building an entire phylogeny based on sequence similarities between ribosomal RNAs. Now that we have entire genomes, that phylogenetic explanation is out the door. And so, we're kind of back to square one in terms of trying to determine origins and phylogenetic histories of even the most simple organisms.
What are the major problems with a purely naturalistic explanation of the origin of life?
Major problems of a purely naturalistic explanation are legion, and I think it's reflective in the results that are published. You can, every year in Science or Nature, there's evidence that life started with black smokers. No, it started in the Arctic or Antarctic environment of cold temperature. How do you get irreducibly complex systems? What is the mechanism? What about information? Where does information come from? Where do the precursors come from? I mean, even Francis Crick drew his, from my understanding, his panspermia theory based on these questions. In part, all life is dependent upon fixation of nitrogen, dinitrogen. I mean, it's triple covalent bonds, a lot of energy to break them. Bacteria have the enzymes to do it. They're dependent on molybdenum, and that's in very low concentration in the crust of this earth. So, all of life depended upon a mineral that, an element that is in such low concentration, taxed his imagination. And there are questions, stereochemistry, same thing. So replication, how do you get replicating systems? RNA world, I think, was a viable alternative, but it's just not panning out.
William Paley described God as a watchmaker. What do you think of this analogy?
I think it's legitimate. I mean, you look at, it goes back to the question, is there a natural explanation for what we see? Is the design real, or is it only apparent? The watch is a paradigm for implying the designer is pretty basic. I mean, consider that watch, if it was able to replicate itself and with fidelity, and that's more closer to the systems that we're looking at. It's still on the table. There's just last May, Lenski from Michigan State with Robert Pinnock published a paper in Nature addressing this very question, and used a computer simulation to show that they could generate complexity from simple virtual organisms. Right? Because we don't have a complete fossil record, because we don't have all the intermediates in the algorithm to build something as complex as the eye, or Paley's watch, although he used the eye too as an example. So lacking this data, we've got to be able to explain these complex structures. You build a computer simulation and you show that you can do it. So the question is still on the table, but we're only going to accept natural explanations. I find it interesting that Lenski has been doing these same experiments with yeast and E. coli for a long time and getting the opposite result. So now you go to a computer simulation, that's revealing in and of itself. And it's somewhat of a shell game in terms of where's the intelligence in the system. The idea that, God wound up the watch, set it on the shelf, and he's out of the picture. It's contrary to, again, the worldview that spawned science. That, as C.S. Lewis said, the watchmaker is both infinite and personal. Freeman Dyson even addresses this question in his book, one of his books. I can't remember the title of it offhand, but he quotes the British poet Auden that Christianity suddenly changed things, that every individual is important and has a story to tell. It revolutionized the arts, it revolutionized science, just from that idea that God is both infinite yet personal, interested in every individual.